Can I pile on to that, guys? It kind of goes back to the question before this question, but it's all related, obviously. That's, Robert, that's a great way of putting the question. And you mentioned the word logistics in there. And one of the things that, let's hypothesize that we build small, but let me back up a little bit. The value of an aircraft carrier and the value of a VLS-equipped Virginia-class submarine and a VLS-equipped Arleigh Burke Aegis cruiser or VLS-equipped or vertical launching system equipped Zumwalt is that you don't have to change the platform just because the weapons change. So in the battleship era, if you built a battleship that had 14-inch guns and it was the top of the pile, then along comes the British and they build 10 battleships with 15-inch guns, you're kind of toast. In the modern era, the reason aircraft carriers have been lasted and had such value for so long is because the carrier is not important. It's the air wing that's on it, and you can constantly evolve that. You look at USS Midway, commissioned in 1945 or 46. Paul served on Midway, and I know he's old, but he's not that old, and so it lasted a long time. All right, so the issue then becomes, okay, we've got the ability to build these buses, and the Navy's actually thought about this before. It's called arsenal ship. Even the idea, I remember somewhere in my junior officer days about equipping merchants with weapons and things like that, and it's doable, especially if you have hypothesized something like a Zumwalt that's able to go and be a stand-in force, to use the term Scott used earlier, inside the denied area. And you have the buses with all the stuff on board outside the area lobbing missiles. Okay, that's all great. Those are wonderful concepts. The question is, why did arsenal ship go away? It wasn't because it was a bad idea. It was because the Navy realized it couldn't afford to build the missiles. Why are Zumwalt's guns, to use a Navy term, dead in the water? Because we can't afford to build the bullets for them. And so we have to think through, as we think about this, not just what are the, as Scott would have argued, not just what are the platforms, what are the weapons, but what's the assembly line to keep weapons in the platforms, and how do you rearm? How do you build enough? So one way to do that is what we did in World War II, and people will argue. You talk to people that work in the missile manufacturing business, and they'll say, well, this is the rate that we can build missiles at. Well, that's true unless the government says, no, we want you to take, building a missile every 2 weeks, and we want you to do that every 2 hours. How would you do that? And what would it take as a commitment from the government to let you do that? Case in point, consolidated plant right there in San Diego, which is now SPAY or in Iowa, whatever it's called now, right there along Route 5. That was a B-24 plant. They built B-24 bombers there. The guy that ran it was a guy named Reuben H. Fleet, who you may have heard of. Got a nice little building up there in Balboa Park. So what Fleet was doing was they had the factory set up, and they were building these B-24s inside the building. And they were building parts inside the building, and they were assembling out on the tarmac. And he couldn't get the production rate up to more than one a day. And so Henry Ford sent one of his guys out there, and the guy overnight, yellow pad, redesigned the factory floor and said, I will build a plane an hour. He said, your problem is you're trying to fit pieces built inside into a plane on the tarmac with a 30-degree difference in temperature. It's not going to work. And so that's how we got to building a plane an hour. It's possible, and we have the manufacturing know how to do it. It's a matter of going back to what Paul said at the very start of this. What's the national commitment? What's the signal to the military and industry, more importantly, and when do we execute that signal? So we have to keep in mind, if our presumption is that all we're going to have in the between now and say 2050 are missiles, because there's just too many technological hurdles for electric weapons, and they're not as offensive as you want to be anyway, then we need to figure out some idea of what the consumption rate might look like, which countries get bad all the time in Great Power War, and then how do we how do we make up that consumption rate? Because right now, you know, we ain't there.
Hey, Gerry, what I would counter with is the Navy said they couldn't afford missiles. What they really meant was that they were unwilling to make the trade-offs necessary to buy the missiles. When you look at the cost of a missile that can have a life of 20 or 30 years versus recruiting, training pilots, the gas that it takes, you know, the cost of the airframe, the gas that it takes to keep the person proficient, gas and maintenance costs, and then amortize that over the number of weapons that are expected to be shot in anger over the life of that pilot and that platform, missiles are a bargain. It's a cultural thing that we chose to continue on with pilots and planes rather than making the shift to the more capable weapons.
Apart from the jibe at the naval aviation community, which I take in good humor, and I think Scott's right about a lot of that. What strikes me about this part of the conversation is that at the beginning of my talk, my introductory remarks, I identified myself as a skeptic, and that's true. I'm skeptical so far about the Navy's ability to come to grips with this, but actually I'm not a pessimist. And the reason is because I know that the Navy notwithstanding, the things we're talking about don't depend upon pulling a rabbit out of a hat. That largely the decision-making aids, from the decision-making aids to the tactical platforms, all of that, this is not only state of the art, but in many ways, outside the Navy, it's a state of practice. So the thing that seems to be the key ingredient here is the ability to revise, revamp the decision-making cycle. And I'm moved to quote, Gerry's heard this so many times, he's gonna close his ears. It's a line from the screenplay of Apollo 13 when the Tom Hanks character, Jim Lovell, is looking up at the moon as Apollo 11 is on the moon. He says to his wife, "It's not a miracle. We just decided to go." And if you think about that, that's actually pretty true. So it's this whole notion of decision-making, the art of the possible, and then getting down to brass tacks and doing it. If you're in business, you'd be a pessimist because you try to bring an idea to the Navy, and the speed of decision-making is, oh my goodness, it's like sometimes in years. Or sometimes you can't get them to decide at all. But I think this can all be done, and that's the good news. So I just wanted to inject that note of optimism here and try to identify what's the missing ingredient here.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I have a technical question here to try to contextualize the Navy's difficulties in making decisions about an uncertain future. Now, a lot of you have talked about the need for profound changes, but also I think I'm fair in saying that several of you have suggested that there is an aversion to change, or a cultural resistance to change, or perhaps a slowness in making changes in the Navy's recent history. And I wonder if that's related to wargaming, because a lot of you have mentioned wargaming too, and some of the capability sectors we're talking about, like cyber warfare, electronic warfare, and even long-range missiles, are very difficult to wargame. So, but having said that, I've always felt that they're easier to wargame in the Navy than they are in ground maneuver forces, where when you model cyber, it's like, you know, you just hypothetically somebody says, well, I would hack that, and the umpire says, yeah, you can, or yeah, you can't, and the other side gets pissed off and say, no, I don't agree with you being able to hack that, and it's highly hypothetical. On the other hand, in the Navy, I mean, I've been on warships during exercises where cyber attacks have turned the lights out, and I felt great that the Navy has, partly because you're dealing with major weapon platforms, where you can model cyber capabilities targeting a platform, a major platform. It seems that the Navy has the privilege, or let's say the privilege of being able to exercise cyber warfare and electronic warfare easier than the other services. So shouldn't we expect the Navy to be more on the ball with these sectors?
Scott, you want to lead us off on that? You're closest to that particular flame.
Well, first I'll say one war game rarely teaches you much, but running a series of similar war games with different audiences converges on not one answer, but generally the left and right limits of the problem. And it eliminates a lot of, it tells you what won't work and gives you some options for what might work. So I would be extremely hesitant to say anything based on a single war game, but what made the Naval War College's experience pre-World War II so effective was that they ran these for years with different student groups in very similar scenarios. And when it comes to cyber, so it's also important to differentiate between wargaming, which is very much about human decision making, and modeling and simulation, which is the more technical. You're running Monte Carlo simulation thousands of times and converging on statistically the way a system is going to react or whatnot. And I think understanding how cyber works on the technology of forces is something that modeling in sim is more appropriate to. Taking those results and putting them into war games so that you understand how humans are going to respond to those impacts. If you put those two together, you'd have something that was pretty powerful. Now, then the rest of your question, is the Navy doing that? I don't believe we are today. Certainly not in a realistic way that tests us at the level that modern combat is going to test us. We still do the majority of our force training for certification against today's missions rather than tomorrow's missions.
I would kind of pile on to what Scott said, that I think this is the problem with wargaming today is in many ways a credibility problem. So you end up with what you described, Bruce. He sank my battleship. No, you can't sink my battleship. Or Paul's famous cartoon, with the Far Side cartoon with the Indians shooting arrows into the wagon and the cowboy saying, "Wait, are they allowed to do that?"
Flaming arrows.
Flaming arrows. Sorry. Thanks, Paul. I stole your ham sandwich story there for a second. So how do you? So this what Scott has just suggested, which is a Monte Carlo M&S approach to start with, that gives you reliable data on the impact of certain aspects of warfare on the overall outcome, and then use that to inform the wargaming piece, where you're training humans or teaching humans or using humans as the guinea pigs, is a huge insight to be able to think about combining those two. And I would submit that, increasingly I work for a company that does Beast Code, that is doing digital twins for the Navy in terms of training and maintenance support and even what-ifing designs. There's no reason that the kind of data detail that comes with that technology can't be expanded to include kind of mushy stuff like EW and cyber and sensor performance and things like that, in a way that's credible, and it makes it objective, and the capacity for handling massive amounts of data is growing every day. And so we should be able to do this as a country, and getting the Department of Defense to understand that and pulling up and see the value of being able to do something like that, where you're running Monte Carlos with a huge amount of data on very realistic and accurate models gives you credible outcomes that then can inform the wargaming piece. Scott mentioned the pre-war or interwar Naval War College wargaming effort, and that was decidedly all analog because that's all they had then. And it was metal warships on a floor and maneuvering those things around. They had a terrible understanding of the enemy. They didn't understand the Japanese Navy and what they were doing and how they were going to fight. The best they could do was use mirror image blue U.S. forces and go at it and see what they were testing was how's the technology going to impact this? So the war game was, okay, here's how far an airplane can go and how fast it can go and how much it can carry today in 1934. Let's just hypothesize that by 1939 it's going to be able to do this and we're going to have this kind of aircraft here. How would that look? How would we play that? In doing that at the War College, not only helped test that out, but it gave the participants, the Ray Spruances and the Frank Jack Fletchers of the world, it gave them the ability to understand carrier warfare, even though they were surface warfare commanders. And so, it expanded the understanding of how this new kind of warfare was going to play out. So I think, it's a huge issue. And, from my personal experience, it's very challenging to get Navy in particular to understand that the tools it has in its hands right now are not optimal. They're not sufficient. They're always questioned. The outcomes are always questioned. And a lot of times the games end up going into what I call the Indiana Jones warehouse, which is this vast warehouse that no one ever looks at again. And so the institution as a whole does not learn from them. And so that is an enormous problem. And there's a growing awareness of it, but not a growing acceptance that the solutions are out there.
Bruce, may I follow up on that for a minute? This raises an issue. First, I don't agree with your conclusion that somehow Navy wargaming is objective, especially with things like cyber, which are just technically hard to game. But I want to make a broader point that applies to many of the things we're talking about, that combinations of things put together in new ways often are the basis for not just evolution, but revolutionary advances. Perfect example, which many are familiar with, is Blitzkrieg, which combined things that weren't even new, but which were held individually by everyone, the airplane, the radio, and the tank, but then used in a different way, made a tremendous difference. Now, the thing about modeling and simulation now, and I'm not a technical expert, is that on the one hand, computing power enables modeling power, repetition, and just crunching those numbers. The algorithms have to be right, but this enables you to do things that you just couldn't do before. But there's something that I think we're on the cusp of potentially at least thinking about, if not actually doing, is combining that with the fidelity of the object of the model, the platform, the weapon, and so on. And I'm working with Gerry on this and Scott on this as well, professionally, which is that if you have this fidelity, what we are starting to call digital twin, that really is very representative at a very detailed level, then what's the significance of combining that with the computing power of the modeling and simulation? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that we ought to know that, because everything we're talking about here in this conversation, and everything, it's a full-time job here in Washington, is how can you be objective about these things? Because if you're objective about them, if you can be objective about them, if you can aspire to objectivity and therefore reasonable conclusions, wouldn't you want to think that through before you get to the battlefield? I mean, that's the whole point, right? And so but we don't have that. That's not state of the practice yet. I believe it's close to being state of the art, but it's not state of the practice. So if we can shift practice in that way, then in many ways we can affect the decisions that are going to have to come and the prioritization and so on, and the investments that we're going to have to make. And it will help us figure out, well, what's the art of the possible here? What could we do faced with these programs? How can we make the Chinese wish they had never been born? And so on. So that's that whole business of new combinations, sometimes old things that exist and sometimes pulled along by new technology. Stealth is an example of that. It can potentially make a huge difference.